I suspect you've heard a little bit about governance. What does governance even mean? What does it mean in digitally networked context? And why is, in particular, the governance of distributed networks like blockchains in particular challenging? These all emanate from the reality that complex human organizations tend to require governance. So my talk today is a bit about how governance varies as a function of an animating purpose for an organization, such that a particular governance structure might not be optimal for all forms of organizing. Second, I'll be talking about how, oddly enough, governance involves conflict, and conflict is especially unavoidable due to my third point, which is our remedies for providing governance are incomplete, known as institutional incompleteness in the relevant literature. But to start off, what is governance? How would I define governance? I define governance as rule-based ordering of people and natural resources. And so effectively, though, that poses the question of who's doing the govern, who's doing the governing, who's being governed by a particular governance regime. And so governance at impersonal scale requires a formally constituted organization. That means an organization is constituted and then it proceeds to articulate rules upon those subject to its governance authority. But that then immediately poses the next question, which brings me to my first point, which is, what is the organization organizing to do? What is the animating purpose for a particular organization? And that purpose may not be tractable to certain forms of governance. And so, put more formally, a given shared purpose will determine the optimality of a given organizational hierarchy to a great extent. I work in a university context as research faculty. Research faculty are never told what they need to research in particular. And it should be obvious that it's probably optimal that way, which is to say, individuals that are highly specialized in a certain area might be best left largely to their own devices to choose the questions they pursue. Granted, after the fact, the extent to which scholars successfully publish in well-respected journals is a function of their performance review and goes into the question of whether or not they ultimately get tenure. So it's not to say the process is without any governance whatsoever. It's to provide a specific example of an organization whose purpose, a university of higher education producing research, an organization whose purpose defines to a great extent the decentralization of decision rights within the organization's hierarchy. A university whose president told every faculty member what they had to research next probably would not remain a university for very long, or at a minimum, not a very well-ranked one. And so my first point is that you need an animating purpose in order to constitute an organization. That's the reason that everyone is at a given organization at a particular moment in time. That's what I'll refer to throughout as an animating purpose. So you need a sufficient level of shared agreement as to that purpose to constitute in the first place. And so a blockchain network can be understood as a form of constitution, which is, it's a set of rules that constrain the behavior of network validators to operate to the benefit of ordinary network users, even though those users might be very actively engaged in governance, although validators frequently are engaged in governance processes themselves. But in each case, they're organized around the shared rules of a network in pursuit of some common understood purpose. So it's important for those engaged in the act of organization design, and make no mistake, the act of launching a blockchain network is fundamentally one of human organizational design. for those engaged in that process, maintaining a close understanding of an animating purpose is really, really important. First of all, because it's a necessary condition for an organization, a collective action organization, as they're called in the scholarship, for a collective action organization to be able to successfully constitute in the first instance. To take a trivial example, groups that are actively at war with one another cannot form a common organization. They do not have a sufficiently shared purpose underlying the different groups that in theory could be constituted into a single organization. So by definition, there is no common set between two groups at war that defines an animating purpose for a given organization. But purpose is more important than simply saying, hey, do we have a sufficiently well understood reason that a group of individuals are constituting an organization? My contention is that is easy, but it's still something that you need to give considerable thought to, such as imagine a case where you have a community treasury intended to be used to fund public goods within a particular DAO ecosystem. So you have this community treasury. Should it be allocated via one token, one vote? Maybe, but maybe not, especially if the case is such that someone can buy an amount of tokens necessary to overcome a vote and direct the allocation of funds to something that has nothing to do with the animating purpose for that particular network. So can you encode perfectly the community goods that a particular DAO will need in the future ex ante to where disbursement of community funds could be automated in complex smart contracts? I'm hopeful that some of those smart contracts will come to be, but eventually there's a real underlying challenge which surrounds the fact that you can't encode all of the reasons, all of the animating principles that lead to the constitution of an organization in the first instance. And so in certain situations, you might actually need human judgment as an input to certain network processes, such as whether funds are devoted to a public purpose as understood by the community. That's what animates a desire to have a one token, one vote model. But what that ignores is the possibility for perverse incentives or the ability to game such a system. Depending on the purpose of a given network, one token, one vote might be great. Depending on the purpose of a different network, one token, one vote might not well be tractable to application in that particular context. Think back to the example of why a university has relatively decentralized decision rights with respect to research faculty. Individual members of sports teams do not get to decide what they're doing in a given moment on the field to the level that members of research faculty do. Different animating purpose, very different governance structure that defines the day-to-day decisions of individuals within that particular system. Networked organizations are no different, and so they definitely also need to take into account at the design stage the animating purpose and many of its downstream implications. So if you can't, though, encode with full confidence ex ante the animating purpose, you try and you design a governance structure, maybe pretty centralized in the case of sports teams, maybe pretty decentralized with respect to research decisions in the case of university faculty. So you design a governance structure and you're like, this reflects our animating purpose. Good. That's the first lesson you should take away from this is how well does a chosen governance structure map to the animating purpose for an organization? But the second point about animating purpose is there is still value in articulating the aspects of that animating purpose that are not operationalizable in code, that are not justiciable in public governance contexts. Nonetheless, you see in many public governance contexts a preamble or even a statement of principles in the Constitution itself that says, this is what we're about. This is what we do as a particular organization, even though those principles are non-justiciable as such, which means that those principles, the articulation of them, tend to have a Schelling point coordination effect in future periods, which is individuals will engage in conflict within any complex impersonal organization at scale. It's inevitable. That's my second point, which I'm about to come to. But articulating the components of an animating purpose that are not justiciable, that are not operationalizable in protocol, nonetheless has considerable value for governance in future periods, because individuals disputing how to proceed will reference core animating principles, usually those laid down by the original designers. The Constitution of the United States is one such example, but the DAO hack in the Ethereum community is another. Should code be immutable? Should terms execute as adopted? Or should the network dial back the blockchain in order of the importance of scaling and the ability to show a willingness to punish bad actors? Those are fundamental principles that by definition, the code could not countenance. And so the act of constituting an organization, it's awesome. Those engaged in private organizational design, it's effervescent. It's unifying. It's, we're coming together to do this cool thing. Isn't this cool? By definition, that pursuit of an animating purpose is something that should be a sort of kumbaya moment within a particular organization. But I'm here to tell you that something weird happens once you constitute an organization, which is suddenly governance is all about conflict. So my first portion can be understood as emphasizing, look, shared values are necessary, but so is conflict resolution. So while a purpose is unifying and the act of constituting it is very much unifying, governance is not. This is because constituting shared values has two structural implications. There is always going to be heterogeneity among organization members. Ethereum miners that currently have very expensive investments in highly specific, capital-intensive mining apparatuses probably are not as stoked about the transition to proof of stake as other users or members of the network that have less invested in fancy graphical processor units. And so there's always going to be heterogeneity among organization members. And when you constitute an organization, this creates a constitutional political economy by definition. Furthermore, because change is inevitable, think about the need for protocol updates on all, like effectively every blockchain network known. The need for protocol updates is direct evidence that change is inevitable. But problematically, within the fixed boundaries of the constitutional political economy that has been created by a given network's rules, within those fixed boundaries, any given change implicates different organization members' interests differently. Put more cynically, this means change creates winners and losers as compared to the status quo within the constitutional political economy of a given organization. So responding to the need to update rules or to make a given collective decision tends to provoke conflict by definition because you have this fixed status quo that has been defined by the act of constituting an organization from the shared values or animating purpose that created the organization in the first instance. So conflict will emerge within this constitutional political economy, but it's actually far more structural than that. Those collective decisions, those updates about which there is unanimity about how to proceed collectively as a function of individual and joint output is that which is least needed to identify and resolve using the collective decision-making apparatus. The more disagreement about a particular issue or a protocol update approaches, the more this disagreement approaches 50-50, or a similarly contentious subset of, say, 4 competing positions on an issue. You name it. But the more you achieve pure conflict, the more this is something that the governance apparatus needs to countenance. And so this is a kind of a hard lesson for protocol design, because it means conflict resolution tends to be inevitable for collective action organizations above a certain scale. And digitally networked organizations are no different. So constraining conflict to occur through collective decision-making processes, as opposed to winner takes all dynamic where the losers exit, constraining conflict to occur productively is hard. But a few lessons are out there for organization designers, including networked organization designers. First, clearly specified decision rules are necessary to coordinate collective decision-making. Absent secondary rules, including the vote threshold for a decision, strategic behavior tends to create cycling in arguments over substance and arguments over process. So constitutionalizing a set of rules and entrenching them about how a given community will make decisions, those probably should not be subject to the same decision rule as substantive decisions in a particular moment. This is called rule entrenchment, and it's kind of the definitional characteristic of constituted organizations, or of a constitution, to put it more simply. Second, limited transparency is also central to legitimizing conflict-prone collective decision-making processes. Transparency as to process as it occurs, and the result of this process, a decision to fund a certain proposal or not, tend to be transparent in representative governance processes. But interestingly enough, for blockchain communities, transparency is kind of taken for granted, such that transparency as to all deliberations may not be desirable, let alone possible. Think of the inevitability of private Signal, Telegram, and Slack channels, as well as it's not really functionally desirable. There are good reasons to debate contentious topics offline before a final decision has been reached. Imagine if you were on a jury and you were told that all deliberations would be public, as well as your vote on whether or not the individual was innocent or guilty. Do you think that would affect your willingness to deliberate? And do you think that the knowledge that the community would see your vote would never subvert your vote in your heart of hearts? Concern being is certain topics need to be debated even if the final decision should fundamentally be transparent in these inevitable conflict resolution processes that emerge in organizations because of the inevitability of conflict emerging in the first instance. Finally, in terms of how do we legitimize conflict within complex organizations, constraint on the authority of anyone especially empowered in governance is also an essential design consideration for legitimizing any representative governance system. Specialization, efficiency in collective decision-making, and the need for rule administration and adjudication all cut towards some measure of concentration of governance authority. But this directly implicates a need to constrain this governance authority on observable margins. Finally, my third point. So first point being, take the animating purpose seriously, including components of it that are not operationalizable in code, but that nonetheless might be useful to define, crystallize, and permanentize ex ante. Think about some, a preamble in the Genesis block of a particular network that can well play a role in guiding future outcomes where no one could have predicted what would emerge. Think of the DAO hack I described. That was a case where institutional foresight was imperfect. And so that brings me to my third point, which is institutional incompleteness is inevitable. The need to change complex organizations is unavoidable, such that mechanisms need to be embedded both to amend the fundamental rules, but also community norms, the things that are very hard to identify and that shift over time. Those same community norms are going to be the direct input to an organization's resilience in periods of true uncertainty. So periods that a particular set of institutional designers can foresee, those are the least contentious, because almost by definition, they've already been considered in the network's protocol design. But circumstances where it's uncertain how to proceed, in those cases, there isn't an answer in terms of automated execution of protocol. Instead, it requires the input of a community external to a given organization. Because rule articulation by collective choice organizations, including digitally networked ones, requires foresight. But as I've emphasized, change springs eternal. As organizations' members, circumstances, competitors, and even purposes change over time. So our foresight is imperfect, as before the myriad downstream contingencies that individual human behavior within rule-based organizations can generate. This means we cannot foresee everything relevant within the action space of members of given digitally networked organizations. Think of the tornado cache sanctions and the ongoing debates about whether network validators should screen transactions from those addresses due to concerns about their own legal liability in the United States. That is not a circumstance that was foreseen when these networks were launched. Or at a minimum, it could not be embedded in protocol, even if individuals did long foresee the concerns associated with regulatory interventions in this space. And so our foresight is imperfect. This means we cannot foresee everything relevant within the action space of members of a given digitally networked organization. More structurally, this means our organization's rules will never cover the full scope of behavior that emerges within their governance. And so because the scope of human action exceeds the foresight of institutional designers, this means unanticipated shocks will arrive with positive probability for all impersonal collective action organizations. And more paradoxically, it is the circumstances that institutional designers cannot foresee that will greatly determine whether their governance system will be viewed as legitimate. It's those times of true uncertainty that provoke true conflict as about how to proceed, especially because people's values and interests are implicated differently by any given change from the status quo, a point I made earlier. And so it's this paradoxical nature that means it's the stuff that you can't formally embed in protocol, the governance preferences, the deep governance values or beliefs of a particular community that a digital network is organizing. It's those governance preferences, the norms and the shared values of that community that the network is organizing are a fundamental input precisely at the times of most uncertainty. So I'm running out of time. Today has been like a 10,000-foot level of, hey, these are the things that seem obvious when you collectively organize in pursuit of an animating purpose. But taking that purpose very seriously at the stage of organizational design is essential because it may imply the extent to which a given form of governance is or is not suitable to optimizing in pursuit of your organization's purpose. Second, despite the fact that constituting in pursuit of a shared purpose is fundamentally sort of unifying, conflict is inevitable and will emerge because of the fact that you're going to have a constitutional political economy, and the need to change to update to new circumstances is one that means people's interests and values will be implicated differently in those change processes, meaning change provokes conflict. Third, and perhaps sort of most summarily, is the fact that institutional foresight is imperfect, including with the ability to resolve conflict. And so the need to accommodate change is inevitable, and it is the shared values, those principles that you can't fully operationalize into the constituted form of the organization itself. It is those shared values that will be a direct input to the decisions in the face of the most unanticipated circumstances. So it's all about purpose, conflict, and uncertainty. Thanks for taking the time to listen.